Zerlina, the filibuster is under more pressure, the filibuster rules, so-called, more pressure in the Senate than ever before. And that's when Lindsey Graham shows the Democrats why they should get rid of it by his promise to filibuster anything that guarantees voting rights.
Well, I think in the tradition, Lawrence, and that history is important to understand because John Calhoun, before Strom Thurmond, also from South Carolina, linked to filibustering, anti-lynching, and other civil rights legislation. So, again, I think Lindsey Graham is hearkening back to a really ugly period of American history. And if you are going to stand in the way of the American people, then what democracy do we have here? I think that the filibuster essentially right now is standing in the way of what a multiracial coalition of voters want. H.R. 1 is supported by 68% of the American people, Lawrence. 60% of Republicans support H.R. 1. And so Lindsey Graham essentially, I guess, would be standing up and defending not expanding voting access and making it easier for Americans to vote. I don't know what arguments he would make. Maybe he would read the rules of cards like Stackhouse did in that West Wing episode.
Right. Let's listen to what Senator Warnock said about this in his first Senate speech.
I stand before you saying that this issue, access to voting and preempting politicians' efforts to restrict voting, is so fundamental to our democracy that it is too important to be held hostage by a Senate rule, especially one historically used to restrict expansion of voting rights.
Zerlina, we're stuck translating some of the things that Democrats are saying about this. Chuck Schumer, he said it to me in an interview, then he said it to Rachel in an interview. Now he says it in every interview that they absolutely will not be blocked by Senate rules on this, that failure is not an option. Joe Biden says you have to do something now. You have to change the rules in whatever way is necessary to get this passed. It's not clear exactly what Joe Manchin will agree to in a rule change, but he's definitely said he's open to some kind of change in this threshold that Republicans currently use to block progress. So we're going to see this unfold. It's hard to say exactly what they have in mind, but they definitely have something in mind.
Oh, I think they have something in mind. And Lawrence, until they commit to changing it or not, they can always use the threat as leverage to get Republicans to compromise or at least not filibuster every single piece of legislation. Additionally, if they try to filibuster H.R. 1 and that I think that gives Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema another second to reconsider their positions. Politically, I think Democrats would love to see Lindsey Graham stand up there and try to defend filibustering expansion of voting rights for the American people so that Joe Biden can get policies done that the American people want, Lawrence. Essentially, what you have now is the filibuster blocking popular policies that the American people want. And that's not a democracy.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear the way they're talking about this is that they intend to go out on the Senate floor without any adjustment to the rules at all and see what happens and then possibly use what happens as their case for making a rule change.
I think that's the smart strategy because at least you have to come to the table, assuming Republicans are operating in good faith, which I think the recent years show us that they probably are not. But as with the COVID relief package, you saw that even with the vast majority of the American public supporting the bill, Republican senators and congresspeople trying to take credit for aspects of the bill they did not vote for, you saw that they were not even going to vote for that, Lawrence, not even in a pandemic, not even in this emergency, to make sure that vaccine distribution money helps to end the pandemic. They didn't even vote for that. So I think that Chuck Schumer already has pretty much plenty of evidence to support the idea. Republicans aren't going to go along with anything. And why would they? I think what they've decided is they're going to restrict voting access to people who are not white, who are not likely to vote for Republicans. And they are going to roll the dice and hope that they can remain in power by restricting those who are able to participate. And again, that is not democracy. And so what the American people need to insist is that our institutions function And if they can't do that, then Democrats should adjust the rules in order to facilitate passage of legislation that the American people want to see happen.
Hey, thanks for watching our YouTube channel. You should know that you can follow today's top stories and breaking news and catch up on your favorite MSNBC shows all in one place. Download the NBC News app today.